pity me," she whispered, her voice breaking as she pressed her back against the weathered saloon door, dust swirling around her torn dress in the merciless afternoon sun. The cowboy standing before her removed his hat slowly, his calloused fingers gripping the brim as his steel-gray eyes met hers. "Ma'am, I ain't offering you pity. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference." Her chin lifted defiantly, even as tears carved clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. "Then what are you offering, Mr. Garrett?" He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and for a moment the chaos of Copper Ridge seemed to fade away. The shouting from the saloon, the thunder of hooves, the distant church bell that had been calling for help that would never come. "All, my love," he said simply, his voice rough as sandpaper but steady as the mountains that watched over their broken little town. But how had they arrived at this moment? How had a desperate Eastern schoolteacher and a wounded former cavalry officer found themselves standing in the dusty street, with her heart breaking and his finally learning to beat again? The story began 3 weeks earlier, when the stagecoach from Boston had rumbled into Copper Ridge carrying more than just another hopeful settler. It carried Rebecca Morrison, who clutched a letter promising marriage to a man she'd never met, and a secret that could destroy everything she was trying to build in this harsh, unforgiving land where survival meant more than just drawing your next breath. The deception had been perfect until the moment Rebecca Morrison stepped off that dust-covered stagecoach and realized the man waiting for her was not the one who'd written those beautiful letters. The real James Patterson turned out to be a wheezing, tobacco-stained man in his 60s with hands that wandered and breath that reeked of whiskey. The letters, those eloquent, tender letters that had convinced her to spend her last dime on Passage West, had been written by his nephew, a cruel joke that left her stranded 1,000 miles from home with nothing but the clothes on her back and a teaching certificate that was worthless in a town that had no school. "Now, darlin'," Patterson wheezed, his yellow teeth showing in what he probably thought was a charming smile. "I know I ain't exactly what you expected, but a deal's a deal. You're here to be my wife, and I got needs that—" "No." The word came out stronger than Rebecca had expected, echoing across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge. "I will not honor a contract built on lies." She turned to walk away, though she had nowhere to go, when a shadow fell across her path. Looking up, she found herself staring into the most startling gray eyes she'd ever seen, set in a face that was all sharp angles and weathered skin, framed by dark hair that needed cutting. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing worn leather chaps and a faded blue shirt that had seen better days. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that made people listen. "You seem to be in need of assistance." Behind her, Patterson was sputtering with indignation. "Now, see here, Garrett. This is between me and my intended—" "Your intended just said no, Patterson." The cowboy's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "In my experience, when a lady says no, a gentleman respects that." Rebecca felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked between the two men. Patterson's face was turning purple with rage, but there was something in the cowboy's stance that suggested challenging him would be unwise. "I don't need charity," she said quietly, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. She needed help desperately, but accepting it from a stranger felt almost as dangerous as staying with Patterson. The cowboy, Garrett, Patterson had called him, studied her face for a long moment. "No, ma'am, I don't expect you do, but I could use someone to keep house at my ranch. It's honest work for honest pay, nothing more. The offer hung in the air between them like dust motes in the afternoon sun, and Rebecca realized that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms. What Rebecca didn't know was that Thomas Garrett had spent the last 3 years avoiding women altogether, and his sudden offer to help her was surprising even to himself. As they rode out to his ranch in his weather-beaten wagon, Rebecca kept stealing glances at the silent man beside her. His hands were steady on the reins, calloused and scarred from years of hard work, and there was something about the set of his shoulders that spoke of a man carrying heavy burdens. The countryside they traveled through was harsh but beautiful, endless grassland stretching toward purple mountains, broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood trees and the winding silver ribbon of Willow Creek. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked, desperate to break the silence that had stretched between them for miles. 4 years, he replied without looking at her. "Built the place myself after I got out of the cavalry." The mention of military service explained the way he carried himself, that unconscious authority she'd noticed in town. But it also explained the shadows she'd glimpsed in his gray eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. His ranch, when they finally reached it, was not what she'd expected. The house was solid timber, well built and maintained, with a wide porch that faced the mountains. There were corrals for horses, a barn that looked like it could weather any storm, and vegetable gardens that showed someone had once cared for them, though they were now choked with weeds. "My wife started those gardens," Garrett said, noticing her gaze. "She died 2 winters ago. Pneumonia." The simple words carried a weight of grief that made Rebecca's chest tight. "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded curtly and climbed down from the wagon. "The arrangement is simple, Miss Morrison. You keep house, cook meals, tend the garden if you've a mind to. In return, you get room and board and $20 a month. No other expectations." The formality in his voice was like a wall between them, and Rebecca understood that this was a man who had loved deeply and was determined never to risk that kind of pain again. She could respect that. After all, she had her own reasons for wanting to avoid emotional entanglements. "That sounds fair, Mr. Garrett." He showed her to a small but clean room at the back of the house, with a window that looked out toward the mountains. The furniture was simple but well made, and someone had left wildflowers in a jar on the dresser, though they were long dead now. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said from the doorway. "Supper's usually at 6. After he left, Rebecca sat on the narrow bed and finally allowed herself to breathe. She'd escaped Patterson, found honest work, and secured a roof over her head. It should have felt like victory, but the silence of the house around her was profound, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. She didn't yet know that Thomas Garrett lay awake most nights, listening to that same wind and remembering his wife's laughter echoing through these same rooms. The unspoken rules of their arrangement became clear over the next few days, as Rebecca learned to navigate life in a house haunted by memories. Thomas Garrett was a man of routines. He rose before dawn, spent his days working with his cattle and horses, and returned to the house only for meals and sleep. He spoke when spoken to, but never lingered for conversation. When Rebecca served breakfast each morning, he would nod his thanks and head out to the range, often not returning until the sun was setting behind the mountains. Rebecca threw herself into her work with the desperate energy of someone who needed to prove her worth. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, organized cabinets that didn't need organizing, and cooked elaborate meals that Thomas ate in silence before disappearing to his room or out to the barn. The gardens were where she found her real purpose. They had been beautiful once. She could see the careful planning in the way the beds were laid out, the climbing roses that still bloomed despite being untended, the herb garden that had gone wild but still produced sage and thyme. Working in the dirt with her hands, Bringing order back to something that had been loved and lost felt like healing. It was while she was weeding the vegetable garden on her 4th morning that she first heard about the Dalton brothers. "Miss Rebecca," called a voice from the road, and she looked up to see a boy of perhaps 12 riding a spotted pony at breakneck speed toward the house. He pulled up in a cloud of dust, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Is Mr. Garrett here? Ma sent me to warn him. The Daltons are back in the territory." Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to the boy, her heart beginning to race at the urgency in his voice. "He's out checking the north pasture. What's wrong? Who are the Daltons?" The boy's eyes were wide. "They're outlaws, miss. Real bad ones. They've been rustling cattle all up and down the valley, and yesterday they hit the Thompson ranch, killed 2 men and made off with near 50 head of cattle." Before Rebecca could respond, she heard the thunder of hooves and turned to see Thomas riding hard toward the house, as if he'd sensed trouble. He pulled up beside them, his horse lathered and breathing hard. "What is it, Billy?" he asked the boy, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "The Daltons, Mr. Garrett. They hit Thompson's place yesterday. Ma thought you should know, seeing as how you're out here alone with—" The boy's gaze flickered to Rebecca, and she understood. He was worried about Thomas being isolated with only a woman for company. Thomas's face had gone stone hard. "Tell your ma I'm obliged for the warning. How many men did Thompson lose?" "2 dead, 3 wounded. They came at dawn, hit fast and hard." Thomas nodded grimly. "Ride home now, Billy, and tell folks to keep their eyes open." As the boy rode away, Thomas turned to Rebecca, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw real emotion in his gray eyes, not the distant politeness he'd maintained, but genuine concern. "Miss Morrison, I need you to understand something. The Dalton gang isn't just cattle rustlers. They're killers, and they don't leave witnesses." The implication hung between them like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. What Thomas didn't tell Rebecca was that the Dalton brothers had a particular hatred for him, dating back to his cavalry days when he'd been the one to capture their younger brother and send him to territorial prison. That evening, as Rebecca prepared supper, she noticed Thomas cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. 2 revolvers lay on the kitchen table beside cleaning cloths and gun oil, and there was a tension in his movements that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Garrett," she said carefully, setting a plate of cornbread on the table, "perhaps you should consider taking me back to town until this trouble passes." He looked up at her, and she was surprised by the intensity in his gray eyes. "Is that what you want?" The question was simple, but the way he asked it made her heart skip. There was something underneath the words, a weight she couldn't quite identify. She began, then stopped. The truth was, she didn't want to go back to town. In the few days she'd been here, this ranch had begun to feel more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. The work satisfied her in a way teaching never had, and despite Thomas's distant manner, she felt safer here than she had since leaving Boston. "I want to stay, if you'll have me." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or relief. "Then you stay, but you need to know what you're getting into." He set down his rifle and leaned back in his chair, his hands flat on the table. 3 years ago, when I was still wearing cavalry blue, my unit was tasked with tracking down the Dalton gang. They'd been terrorizing settlers from Colorado to the Montana border, leaving a trail of burned homesteads and unmarked graves. We finally cornered them in a canyon about 50 miles north of here. Rebecca sat down across from him, sensing that this was the most he'd spoken about his past since she'd arrived. "There were 5 of them then," Thomas continued, his voice quiet but steady. "The 3 brothers, Colt, Jake, and young Danny, plus 2 other men. We took them in a firefight that lasted most of the afternoon, Danny Dalton, he couldn't have been more than 19, took a bullet in the leg and went down early. When the smoke cleared, the 2 hired guns were dead, and I had the 3 brothers in custody. He paused, his fingers drumming against the table. Colt and Jake got 20 years in territorial prison. Danny got 10, being younger and less involved. But prison changed them, especially Colt. Word is he spent every day planning what he'd do when he got out. "And they're out now?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. 6 months ago. Danny died of consumption in prison, which just made Colt and Jake angrier. They blame me for their brother's death, for breaking up their gang, for everything that went wrong in their lives. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "So when they come here, and they will come here, it won't just be about cattle." Thomas met her eyes across the table, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. It wasn't just concern for her safety. It was something deeper, more personal. "No, Miss Morrison. When they come, it'll be about settling old scores." The attack came 3 nights later, not with the dawn as everyone expected, but in the darkest hour before sunrise, when even the most vigilant man might let his guard down. Rebecca woke to the sound of breaking glass and Thomas shouting her name. She rolled out of bed, her heart hammering, and grabbed the small pistol he'd insisted she keep beside her bed. Through her window, she could see orange flames dancing in the barn and the silhouettes of men on horseback. In the yard. "Rebecca!" Thomas's voice came from the front of the house. "Stay down and get to the root cellar." But as she crept toward her bedroom door, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A scream from the direction of the barn, high and agonized. One of the horses was trapped in the fire. Without thinking, she ran through the house toward the back door, ignoring Thomas's shouts. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky, but she could hear the terrified neighing of horses still trapped inside. Thomas's prize stallion, Thunder, was in there, along with 2 mares and their foals. She was halfway across the yard when a figure stepped out of the shadows, a tall man with cruel eyes and a face marked by years of hard living. This had to be Colt Dalton, and the way he smiled when he saw her made her skin crawl. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying easily over the crackling of flames. "Garrett's got himself a woman. Ain't that sweet?" From somewhere behind the burning barn, she heard gunfire. Thomas was fighting for his life while she stood here like a fool, facing down a killer with nothing but a small pistol she barely knew how to use. "Where is he, darlin'?" Colt asked, taking a step closer. "My old friend Tom Garrett. We've got some catching up to do." Rebecca raised the pistol, surprised that her hands were steady. "I don't know what you want with him, but you need to leave, now." Colt laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You got spirit, I'll give you that. Too bad you picked the wrong man to throw in with." The gunfire behind the barn was getting closer, and Rebecca realized with growing terror that Thomas might be retreating toward the house, which meant he was either injured or outnumbered, or both. "See? Your Tom Garrett killed my baby brother," Colt continued, circling her like a predator. "Put him in a cage where he died coughing up blood, all alone. Now I'm going to return the favor." It was then that Rebecca understood. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making Thomas watch her die before they killed him too. She steadied her grip on the pistol and made a choice that would change everything. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me first." The words hung in the smoky air between them, and for the first time in years, Rebecca Morrison felt truly, completely alive. The shot that rang out in the darkness didn't come from Rebecca's pistol. It came from Thomas's rifle, and Colt Dalton dropped like a stone, clutching his shoulder and cursing. Thomas materialized from the shadows like an avenging angel, his face streaked with soot and blood, his rifle trained on the wounded outlaw. Behind him, Rebecca could see Jake Dalton's body sprawled near the burning barn, and she realized Thomas had been systematically hunting them through the darkness. "Rebecca, get back to the house," Thomas ordered, never taking his eyes off Colt. "Now!" But before she could move, Colt Dalton raised his own pistol with his good hand, his face twisted with pain and rage. "If I can't kill you, Garrett, I'll settle for killing what you care about." Time seemed to slow as Rebecca saw the outlaw's finger tighten on the trigger, the barrel swinging toward her. She dove to the side, hearing the crack of the gunshot and feeling the bullet whistle past her ear, so close she could feel the heat of it. Thomas's answering shot took Colt Dalton's center mass, and the outlaw fell backward into the dirt, his pistol tumbling from lifeless fingers. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the dying fire and their own ragged breathing. Then Thomas was beside her, his hands on her shoulders, checking for injuries with a desperation that had nothing to do with mere concern for an employee. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with smoke and something deeper. "Rebecca, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she whispered, though she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Thomas, I'm fine." It wasn't until after he'd pulled her against his chest, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek, that she realized she'd called him by his first name. "I thought I'd lost you," he said into her hair, and the raw pain in his voice made her look up at him. In the flickering light from the dying fire, his gray eyes held an emotion she'd never seen there before, not just relief, but something that looked suspiciously like love. "You didn't lose me," she said softly. "I'm right here." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she'd been crying. "When I saw him pointing that gun at you, I thought, God, Rebecca, I thought I was going to watch you die, and I realized I couldn't survive that. Not again." The reference to his late wife hung between them, but instead of creating distance, it drew them closer. She understood now that his careful walls hadn't been about not caring. They'd been about caring too much. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. And when he kissed her, desperate and tender and full of 3 years' worth of suppressed longing, she kissed him back with all the love she'd been trying not to feel. When they finally Lee broke apart. The barn had collapsed into glowing embers, and the first light of dawn was painting the mountains gold. But they had survived, together, and sometimes that's all the victory you need. The days following the attack revealed depths to both Rebecca and Thomas that neither had suspected existed beneath their careful facades. While Thomas dealt with the sheriff and the cleanup from the fire, Rebecca threw herself into the work of rebuilding. She organized supplies, coordinated with neighbors who came to help, and took charge of the practical details with an efficiency that surprised everyone, including herself. She discovered that she had a talent for leadership, for seeing what needed to be done and making it happen. "Ma'am," said old Pete Wilson, who'd come with his sons to help raise a new barn, "I ain't never seen someone organize a barn raising like you just did. You got a gift for this kind of work." Thomas, overhearing this conversation, felt a pride that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with recognition. He was watching Rebecca come into her own, becoming the woman she was always meant to be, and it was beautiful to see. But the attack had changed things between them in ways that went beyond stolen kisses and whispered promises. They moved around each other differently now, with an awareness that was both thrilling and terrifying. When she handed him coffee in the morning, their fingers would brush and linger. When he passed behind her chair at dinner, his hand would rest briefly on her shoulder, a touch that spoke of claim and comfort both. "We need to talk," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. "About what this is, between us." Rebecca set down her coffee cup and turned to face him. "What do you want it to be?" It was a simple question, but Thomas found himself struggling for words. He'd loved his first wife with the uncomplicated devotion of a young man, but what he felt for Rebecca was something altogether different. Deeper, more complex, built on shared struggle and mutual respect as much as desire. "I want," he began, then stopped. "Rebecca, I'm not the same man I was before the war, before Sarah died. I've got scars, inside and out, that may never fully heal. I wake up some nights thinking I'm still in a cavalry camp or dreaming about the men I've killed. I'm not easy to live with." She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Do you think I'm the same woman who stepped off that stagecoach? I've been running from something too, Thomas. From expectations, from a life that never fit, from the person everyone else wanted me to be." He looked at their joined hands, noting how her small fingers looked nestled in his larger, scarred ones. "What are you running toward?" "This," she said simply. "You, this life we're building together. I know it's not easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is." The silence that followed was comfortable, full of possibility and the kind of peace that comes from being truly understood. "There's something else," Thomas said finally. "Something I should have told you before." The serious tone in his voice made Rebecca's heart skip. "What is it?" "I love you, Rebecca Morrison. Not because you're convenient, not because I need a housekeeper, but because you're brave and stubborn and beautiful, and you make me want to be better than I am." She felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that come with relief and joy combined. "I love you too, Thomas Garrett. More than I ever thought possible." When he kissed her this time, it was with the promise of forever. 3 weeks later, Rebecca stood in front of the cracked mirror in her room, adjusting the simple blue dress she'd worn on the day she'd arrived in Copper Ridge, and tried to convince herself she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. Today was their wedding day, a small ceremony at the church in town, with just a few neighbors as witnesses. Thomas had insisted on doing things properly, despite her protests that she didn't need ceremony or fuss. But she understood now that it wasn't about what she needed. It was about what he needed, what they both needed to make this real and permanent and true. "Nerves are normal," she told her reflection, but her hands were shaking as she tried to pin her hair into something resembling respectability. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a desperate woman with nowhere to go. Now she was about to marry a man who loved her, who'd risked his life to protect her, who made her feel like she could be anyone she wanted to be. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Rebecca?" Thomas's voice was muffled through the wood. "Are you ready?" She opened the door to find him standing there in his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a string tie that he'd obviously been fighting with. His hair was combed back, and his boots were polished, and he looked so handsome it made her breath catch. "You clean up nice, Mr. Garrett," she said, reaching up to straighten his tie. "So do you, Miss Morrison," he replied, but there was something in his voice that made her look up at him more carefully. "What is it?" she asked. "Are you having second thoughts?" He cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes serious. "Never. But I need you to know, this isn't going to be easy. Ranch life is hard, and I'm not always the easiest man to live with. There'll be times when the cattle market is bad, when the weather doesn't cooperate, when money's tight and tempers are shorter." Rebecca smiled, covering his hands with hers. "Thomas, I didn't fall in love with you because I thought it would be easy. I fell in love with you because you're worth the difficulty." The ride into town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Copper Ridge looked different to Rebecca now, not like the rough, unfriendly place she'd first seen, but like home. She knew the shopkeepers, had shared meals with the neighbors, had earned her place in this community through her own efforts. At the church, a small crowd had gathered, more people than they'd expected, drawn by curiosity and genuine affection. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had brought wildflowers for Rebecca to carry, and old Pete Wilson was there with his wife, beaming like he was giving away his own daughter. But it was when she saw Patterson in the crowd, his face twisted with bitterness and something that looked like rage, that Rebecca felt her first real flicker of unease. "He's just bitter," Thomas murmured, following her gaze. "He can't hurt you now." But as they walked toward the church steps, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that Patterson's presence was more than just coincidence. Some grudges, she was beginning to learn, died harder than others. The ceremony itself was simple and beautiful, conducted by Pastor Matthews in his warm, gravelly voice that seemed to give weight to every word of the vows they spoke to each other. When Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring, which he'd kept safe through years of war and loss, Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest, a sense of belonging that went deeper than law or custom. When she promised to love him in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death did them part, she meant every word with a fierceness that surprised her. "You may kiss your bride," Pastor Matthews said with a smile. And when Thomas kissed her there in front of God and the whole community, Rebecca felt like she was finally, truly home. The celebration afterward at the Wilsons' farm was lively, with fiddle music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Rebecca found herself swept into conversation after conversation, accepting congratulations and well-wishes from people who had once been strangers, but now felt like family. "You done good, girl," Mrs. Henderson said, squeezing Rebecca's hands. "That man's been alone too long. He needed someone like you to bring him back to life." But it was when she was serving punch to some of the children that Rebecca noticed Patterson hovering near the edge of the crowd, nursing a bottle of whiskey and watching her with cold, calculating eyes. Every time she looked his way, he'd raise the bottle in a mocking toast, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Don't let him spoil your day," Thomas said, appearing beside her with 2 plates of food. "He's just a bitter old man." "I know," Rebecca said, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Patterson's presence than simple bitterness. There was something predatory in the way he watched her, something that made her skin crawl. The feeling intensified when, later in the evening, she stepped outside for some fresh air and found Patterson waiting for her in the shadows beside the Wilson barn. "Well, well," he said, swaying slightly on his feet. "If it ain't the new Mrs. Garrett. How's married life treating you so far?" "Mr. Patterson," Rebecca said calmly, though her heart was racing, "I think you've had enough to drink." He laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Enough to drink? Honey, I'm just getting started. See, I got something to tell you about your new husband. Something you deserve to know." Rebecca took a step back, but Patterson moved with her, cornering her against the barn wall. "Did he tell you about the woman before you? The one who died so conveniently when she started asking questions about where he'd really been during the war?" "You're drunk," Rebecca said firmly, "and you're lying." "Am I?" Patterson's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Ask him about Fort Kearny, about what really happened to his unit. Ask him why he's got all that gold hidden under his floorboards, and where it came from." Before Rebecca could respond, Thomas's voice cut through the darkness like a bee laid. "That's enough, Patterson." Patterson straightened, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip, but Thomas was already there, moving with the deadly grace of a trained soldier. "Walk away," Thomas said quietly. "Now, while you still can." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and after a long moment, Patterson stepped back, his hands raised in mock surrender. Sure, sure. Just wanted to congratulate the happy couple. But this ain't over, Garrett. Not by a long shot. As Patterson stumbled away into the darkness, Rebecca turned to Thomas, questions burning in her eyes. But the look on his face told her that Patterson's words, drunk or not, had hit closer to the truth than she'd wanted to believe. The ride back to the ranch was silent except for the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the whisper of wind through the grass, but the questions hung between them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It wasn't until they were inside their house, Rebecca reminded herself, though it felt strange to think of it that way now, that Thomas finally spoke. "You want to ask me about what Patterson said?" he said, hanging his hat on the hook by the door. His voice was carefully neutral, but Rebecca could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "I want you to tell me the truth," Rebecca replied, removing her gloves with steady hands despite the turmoil in her chest. "All of it. About Fort Kearny, about what happened during the war, about whatever it is you think I can't handle." Thomas was quiet for so long that Rebecca began to wonder if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with old pain. "Fort Kearny was a supply depot," he said, staring out the window toward the mountains. "My unit was stationed there in the winter of '64, guarding a shipment of gold meant to pay Union troops in Colorado. The fort was isolated, cut off by snow for months at a time." He turned to face her, and Rebecca saw something in his gray eyes that made her heart ache. Shame and guilt, and a weariness that went bone deep. There was an outbreak of fever that winter. Started with the horses, but it spread to the men. We lost half our number in 3 weeks, including our commanding officer. The survivors. We were desperate, half-starved, and facing the very real possibility that we wouldn't make it to spring. Rebecca sat down heavily in her chair, beginning to understand where this story was leading. "The gold was just sitting there," Thomas continued. "Enough money to set every surviving man up for life. The government would assume it was lost with the fort, with all the men who'd died. It would have been so easy to just take it." "But you didn't," Rebecca said, though it came out as more of a question than a statement. Thomas met her eyes. "No, I didn't. But I was the only one who didn't. 5 men broke into the strongbox one night, took what they could carry, and disappeared into the wilderness. When spring came and the supply trains resumed, I was the only one left to tell the story. And they blamed you for the theft. The army needed someone to blame, and I was convenient. I was court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, and spent 2 years in military prison. When I got out, I had nothing. No family, no money, no prospects. The only thing I had was the knowledge of where those 5 men had buried part of that gold before they split up." Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. "The money you used to buy this ranch?" Thomas nodded, his face carved from stone. "I tracked down the cash 2 years after I got out of prison. Told myself I was just taking what was owed to me, compensation for the 2 years of my life they'd stolen. Used it to buy this land, build this house. Used it to start over." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca stared at the man she'd just married, trying to reconcile the honorable man she'd fallen in love with this story of theft and deception. "So Patterson was right," she said finally. "You're a thief." "Yes," Thomas said simply. "I am." The word hung in the air between them like a death sentence, and Rebecca felt something crack inside her chest. Not her love for him, but her certainty about who he was and what their life together would mean. She stood up slowly, her wedding dress rustling in the silence, and walked to the window. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging under the star-filled sky, and she found herself thinking about redemption, about the distance between who we were and who we choose to become. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked without turning around. "You could have kept it secret forever." "Because you deserve to know the truth before—" He stopped, his voice catching. "Before you're trapped in a marriage with a man who built his life on stolen gold." Rebecca turned to face him, and what she saw in his eyes broke her heart in an entirely different way than she'd expected. This wasn't the face of a man who was proud of what he'd done, or even particularly sorry for it. This was the face of a man who had been carrying shame and guilt for years, who had convinced himself he didn't deserve love or happiness or peace. "Do you still have it?" she asked. "The gold?" "Most of it, yes. Hidden under the floorboards in the bedroom, just like Patterson said." "And what were you planning to do with it?" Thomas looked genuinely surprised by the question. I hadn't thought about it. It's just been there, like a weight I carry around." Rebecca walked back to him, noting how he tensed as she approached, as if expecting her to recoil or strike him. Instead, she reached up and cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Thomas Garrett," she said firmly, "you are not the same man who took that gold. The man I married would give his life to protect innocent people. The man I married built something good and honorable out of something broken. The man I married chose to tell me the truth, even when it might cost him everything." "Rebecca, no. Let me finish." Her voice was steady, sure. "I'm not saying what you did was right. I'm saying that what you've become matters more than what you were. And if you want to make peace with your past, then we find a way to return that gold to where it belongs, or use it to do some good in the world." He stared at her as if she'd just performed some kind of miracle. "You're not leaving?" "Where would I go?" she asked, and she was surprised to find herself smiling. "This is my home now. You're my home now. For better or worse, remember?" When he kissed her then, it was with the desperate gratitude of a drowning man who'd been thrown a rope, and Rebecca understood that this was what love really meant. Not loving someone despite their flaws, but loving them enough to help them become better than they thought they could be. 6 months later, the territorial government received an anonymous donation to fund the building of schools throughout the region. Enough gold to educate a generation of children in small frontier towns that had never been able to afford teachers. Rebecca never asked Thomas if he missed the weight of that secret, and he never asked her if she sometimes wondered what other secrets he might be carrying. They had learned that trust wasn't about perfect transparency. It was about believing that the person you loved would choose to do right, even when doing right was harder than doing wrong. Their ranch prospered, their love deepened, and when their first child was born the following spring, a daughter with Thomas's gray eyes and Rebecca's stubborn chin, they named her Hope, because sometimes the best things in life come from the ashes of our worst mistakes. On quiet evenings, when the sun set behind the mountains and the wind whispered through the grass, Rebecca would sometimes remember that moment outside the church when she'd begged him not to pity her, and he'd promised her all his love instead. It had turned out to be the best bargain she'd ever made. And if you've made it this far in their story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me on this journey through the Wild West. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more romantic adventures, and let me know in the comments what other kinds of stories you'd love to hear. Your support means everything to a storyteller like me, and I can't wait to share more tales of love, courage, and redemption with you soon.